Hello, I'm Alan Weil, Editor-in-Chief of Health Affairs. Thank you for joining us for the latest in our series of Policy Spotlight discussions. Policy Spotlight is a series of virtual events Health Affairs launched last year, featuring in-depth conversations with influential health policy experts. Previous Spotlight events have featured CMS Administrator Chiquita Brooks-LaSure, CMS Innovation Center Director Liz Fowler. Most recently, I had Admiral Rachel Levine, HHS Assistant Secretary for Health, on as a guest. If you missed these events as they aired, they were all recorded and can be viewed on our website. If you're watching us live, you can submit a question using the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom screen. I'll try to bring in as many questions as possible. If you put them in early and keep them brief, that will make it easier for me to take a look at them. Today, I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Robert Califf, Commissioner of the United States Food and Drug Administration. The mission of the FDA is to protect and promote the public health by ensuring the safety, efficacy, and security of human and veterinary drugs, biological products, and medical devices, and by ensuring the safety of our nation's food supply, cosmetics, and products that emit radiation. That's, of course, taken from the FDA website, and while the scope of the agency is broad, we'll certainly focus on the drug regulation side of the FDA in our conversation today. My guest, as I said, is Dr. Robert Califf, who was nominated by President Biden, sworn in as commissioner on February 17th of 2022 this year. It's his second tenure in the role, which he also held from February of 2016 to January of 2017, after having served as Deputy Commissioner for Medical Products and Tobacco. During the interim, he was head of medical strategy and senior advisor at Alphabet Inc., contributing to strategy and policy for its health subsidiaries, Verily Life Sciences and Google Health. Earlier, he was a professor of medicine and vice chancellor for clinical and translational research at Duke University and director of the Duke Translational Medicine Institute and the Duke Clinical Research Institute. He's been a frequent contributor to Health Affairs, and in 2017 was one of 7 former FDA commissioners who co-authored a piece for what was then our blog, now Forefront, which called for the FDA to be an independent federal agency. Welcome, Dr. Califf. It's so good to have you with me today. I always like to start these out by just giving my guest an opportunity to spend a couple of minutes laying out your key priorities for the FDA as you've taken the helm.
Thanks, Alan. And of course, when you're regulating 20% of the economy, there are a lot of priorities. So I'll name a few specific ones and then a few overarching ones. Obviously, coming into the job, the pandemic is a major and ongoing priority, consumes a lot of energy and time and calls for creativity at every step of the way, including with the current BA.5 wave that we're having and the vaccination campaign coming up. And then on top of that, of course, we have monkeypox now, which is, came up quickly and is really a major issue that we're scrambling to deal with. Along the way, as I was going through confirmation, I got a lot of calls about the food side of the FDA that it needed attention. The slogan being the F in FDA does stand for food. So my first 5 months in the job have confirmed that indeed the food side needs attention. It's been under-resourced, and we've been working hard on it. We're going to continue to do so. And then, of course, on the medical product side, a lot of attention to issues like accelerated approval, which I know we'll talk about, and the need to balance innovation with safety, which is a really fascinating part of this job. Overarching, there are really 2 big things that it's a longer list, but the 2 biggest things that I'm concerned about are misinformation. I've argued that we're actually losing the battle on misinformation right now, evidenced by the vast number of Americans who have not been vaccinated or not gotten up-to-date boosting when the evidence is so clear that it's life-saving and prevents serious illness. And in addition to misinformation, we need a better evidence generation system in this country. I shouldn't have to tell Health Affairs that. I know that you spend all of your journal space trying to decipher what's going on from the mishmash of evidence that we have, and we can certainly talk more about that. And then I'd add one other category of things, opioids being the prime example. We have a variety of substances in our society that may have a variety of uses, legitimate and illegitimate, that wise people have decided the FDA should regulate. Opioids is certainly a major crisis right now, again, with over 100,000 people dying in the last 12 months from overdose, and we have a methamphetamine crisis going on at the same time. But I'd add to that list cannabis, kratom, and tobacco as substances that we must regulate, where the pathways are either new with tobacco. Our teenage 13-year-old part of the FDA are really not fit for purpose with things like cannabis, with over 30-something products now from cannabis that could be thought of as a food, additive, or an illegal substance, depending on what you're using it for and your point of view. So these are things that we'll be working on. I'll stop there. I could go on and on. It's a never-ending stream of priorities.
I am sure it is, and I will make sure to leave some time to talk about both of those. I'm going to start with a few items that are on my mind as we come to the conversation today. We're about 3 decades into our reliance on user fees to support the drug review process, and we're in the midst of reauthorization discussions around PDUFA. I wonder if you could step back and look at that rather extensive history and give me your thoughts about the whole shift to relying on user fees to support the process. And I guess I should ask if you have contingencies in mind. Nothing is routine in Congress anymore, and if that process is delayed, what do you do? But let's start with the broader question. What's your take on this structure?
Well, if I was a philosopher king, we would not have user fees. I mean, in theory, the FDA is regulating industries in the interest of society and the public health. It seems like a good place for the taxpayer to cover the cost to make sure that the FDA is independent of that industry. But I live in the real world, and certainly one of the really amazing things about FDA is there are many theoretical issues. Many of them come to a head when the FDA has to make a decision that affects people. And so, if I were defending user fees, which I am now, because we do live in the real world, the user fees bring a certain discipline to the organization, which is much more like business, that, for example, is harder to achieve on the food side, because everything that we do in the user fees is subject of metrics and is publicly available. The industry is well aware of it. It allows in administration, I've been in academia, business, health systems, et cetera. It allows for, management, which is much more effective and organized, in my view, and people know what they're paying for. So the user fees have certainly made a huge difference for the medical products side of the FDA, and the absence of user fees on the food side has been a problem. If the taxpayer paid more, it wouldn't be such a problem, but especially with 21st century cures as part of it, the salaries are different, the working conditions are different. We need all parts of the FDA supported. The negative part of it is that it's almost all focused on pre-market activity, and we have a major responsibility for the life cycle of medical products that is relatively underfunded and needs continued work. Now, as for contingencies, I think most people in this audience probably know we're coming up against a deadline where if we don't get agreement on the user fees, just for those who don't know, let me just note that there's been agreement between FDA and the industry and the patient groups and the many people that have to agree on the basic foundation of the next 5 years of user fees. But we have to have Congress also agree, and that's where we're stymied right now. But as of the first week of September, since we have a fiduciary responsibility to our employees, if we don't have confidence that the user fees are going through, we'll have to start sending notices of potential layoffs and cut back in employees. And, we will always try to conduct our core public health activities, but things like new drugs, the revolution in the gene therapy, amazing digital devices, all these things that are, really exciting and in the hopper, are just, there'll be no way to deal with them because we won't have people to actually do the reviews that are needed. So this is an urgent matter to us. And I'll just note, Congress has always come through in the past. And, I get a lot of assurances that will happen this time. So I'm optimistic that it will happen, but we also have responsibilities to our employees.
Yeah, that date isn't very far away. Just before we leave the user fee topic, I appreciate the difference between being a philosopher king and living in the real world, but it does sound like what you're saying is that the user fee structure does, in some sense, distort the resource allocation. If you were to sit with a total appropriation for the FDA and you were to try to figure out how much should go to different functions, you might have a different answer than when the user fees come in and create resources in some places that just don't exist in others. Is that a fair conclusion?
I think it's partially fair. I mean, I would say it a bit differently than the way you said it. Because the user fees are metricized to the specific activities, there are X number of new drug applications and Y number of meetings that need to occur. And, we have good metrics on how long it takes to review an application and prepare for a meeting and do all those things, just like happens in a business. The user fees for those activities are basically what it takes to do the work. But I think we need more emphasis on the post-market phase now for reasons that I'm sure we'll talk about with some of your other questions.
Oh, yes, we'll definitely get to that. And but I appreciate the clarification of the redirect of how I said it. I think that's very helpful. Well, sitting in the health policy world, there was a lot of noise and activity around the Aduhelm approval. And I won't try to walk through all the steps of it. But I wonder if maybe we could just start by me asking you how you reflect on what happened there. Are there things that, are there lessons that you draw from it, positive or negative? Are there changes in the approval process that you think are warranted because of that experience? I'll just start with it at a fairly general level and see where we go.
Sure. And I'm very at risk of confirmation bias. I'm about turned 71. You observe a lot of things, you form opinions, and then you tend to see in the next thing that happens what you believed before. So I'm not going to comment on the decision itself for approval because I think that's been much discussed, and it's perfectly reasonable for highly intelligent people to come to different conclusions about that. The great thing I think about the FDA is these decisions are not made by the politically appointed commissioner. They're made by full-time civil servants who have no financial conflict of interest. And one can question their judgment, but the motivation, is not based on favoring one company or another. So the decision was made, and then, I most of my career in academia was clinical practice and doing clinical studies and clinical trials. In that gap between sort of a product might be useful and the point at which it's actually has a place in practice that's understood with a value. A lot, almost all the big clinical trials we did in cardiovascular disease actually did the cost effectiveness analysis built into the large pragmatic clinical trials that we did. And, that was very helpful in being able to understand what the cost per year of life saved or whichever, or quality of life used. But, for the most part, there's a gap there in the evidence system, which is not handled well. And it really became apparent because when the approval happened, and I was not in the FDA then, so I wasn't part of the discussion, but when the word first came out that it would take 9 years to do the confirmatory study, that just didn't sit well with even people who thought the approval was good. And there's no reason with the technology and money that we have that we don't have a system that generates the needed evidence while products are, beginning to get into use. And I think that's a major priority of mine, is to work with federal and private partners to create a much more effective evidence generation system. There's also an analogy I've used that I think a lot of people sort of have thought was okay, which is the way the US system works. The FDA is in a relay race where it runs the first lap and then it drops the baton at the end of the lap in the dark. And CMS and the payers have to figure out where the baton is, pick it up, and start over again. That just doesn't make good common sense. We ought to be running side by side for the last, whatever, quarter of a lap or certain number of yards, so that the transition in evidence need is more continuous and filling that evidence gap as time goes on. So we understand how to use the products, how they fit in with other things, and what the actual value is. So we've had some very productive discussions with CMS, including Chiquita Brooks LaSure, as you know, and so that's going to be a real point of emphasis over the next several years, is to try to work out a better system in the handoff of that baton between FDA and the payers. So that's, there are a lot of details I could talk about. I spent a lot of time on it, but to me, it really confirmed something that I came back into the job with hopes of dealing with. And it's an example that I think has caused a lot of people to understand why I thought it should have been a priority in the first place.
Well, there are a few details I guess I would like to go a little deeper into. So you talked about the 9 years in evidence generation. Certainly, it would be. I think it would be hard to argue that it wouldn't. That with the notion that it would be better for that to be faster, and that's a sort of a jaw-dropping time. But does that, given what it is or was at the time, and I understand you weren't at the FDA, does that have implications for accelerated approval in the first place?
I would, this was a new area for accelerated approval. So, was it optimal in terms of how the pieces of the puzzle fit together? I think the answer is obviously no. Does it mean that accelerated approval should never be used for a long-term chronic disease that doesn't have an effective treatment? I'd say the answer to that is no. I just think we've got to work it out better so that we have a system that's effective within this intermediate phase. When I talk about this, I often use the example of heart valves, just so we're not focused on the details of this one case. Imagine if we said for a heart valve to be used in practice, we have to do the 20-year follow-up that's needed to know what the rate of deterioration of the valve is before we put on the market. Well, we'd have no new heart valves. And thank goodness that we figured out that we actually have to move based on the best evidence we have in shorter studies and then do the long-term follow-up. And so we have a whole array of chronic diseases where, particularly in the neurodegenerative area and in gene therapy for children, where I think a similar issue is coming into play. We just have to be creative in a better solution.
That's very helpful. In this instance, the FDA did not follow the advisory panel's recommendation. Does that give you any thoughts or pause regarding the role of the panel and how they fit into the process?
Well, I was one of the most fun and interesting jobs I ever had was chairing the cardiorenal advisory panel decades ago. I think it's really important. So I've had thoughts and ideas about how it should be better for quite a while. This is my chance to do something about it. But I make a few points that I think have been somewhat misleading about what people have said about this particular issue. Advisory panels are just that, they're advisory. They're not to tell the FDA what the answer is. And, I would say in general, we need to make better use of advisory panels on a continuous basis. I mean, the idea is when you work inside the FDA, you're not conflicted, as I said, financially, but it's hard to know what's going on out there in the real world. And the world of science is vast. So we need outside advisors that are cleared through a process that enables them to interact with the FDA. And we ought to use them more often, in my view. And I felt like maybe 20 years ago, we were more useful as an advisory panel to the ongoing evolution of knowledge and process within the FDA. Second thing is, studies of disagreements between the direction of an advisory panel and the FDA. The largest one showed that there's disagreement over 20% of the time. This is not new, it's historic. But the majority of the time, the FDA takes a more conservative opinion than the advisory panel. So disagreements don't necessarily go one way or another. I would also say that in general, it would be good practice, I think, to reconvene advisory panels when there is a major change. And I think you're seeing that within CEDAR with several of the projects that are ongoing now. So I think there was a lesson learned with that. But under no circumstance would I say the FDA is asking an advisory panel, should we approve this drug, intending to not take into account all the other factors and the internal knowledge of the FDA and other sources of knowledge that may be existent that are not held in the advisory panel.
I was really intrigued by your comment about coordination between FDA and CMS, and from the outside, I think you're dropping the baton in the dark. Metaphor is a good one. Without prejudging where that lands, can you give us a little more detail on what kinds of alignment you're talking about, and frankly, what fits within the statutory constraints that both of you face? Your statutory regimes are really very different.
Well, I think it's true that we have different jobs, and I'm not proposing that changes. We have an accountability for safety and effectiveness of a medical product for a particular indication and a particular population to allow initial marketing, and then the practice of medicine does a lot of things with it. CMS has got a different standard, but there's a continuum of evidence that should link those two things together, not in lockstep, but in terms of a sort of a string of evidence that would allow one to, I think, understand best how to use a medical product. So, look at the device side as an example. There's nothing prohibiting meetings between FDA and CMS to talk about upcoming issues, and we'll certainly do that more often. We wouldn't be the first time it's happened. There was an effort to do this, I've learned, some 30 years ago. I don't know all the details, but there shouldn't be surprises on the CMS side that lead to controversy. So there may be differences of opinion still between the two agencies. That's fine. I do think coverage with evidence development is a concept that's got legs, in my opinion. I was very involved in the coronary stent effort to do that, and the cardiac defibrillator effort to do it. I'm a cardiologist, did a lot of the clinical trials that were involved in those technologies. And I think there it worked pretty well too. And a lot of lives have been saved. You can argue that stents have been overused, probably the case, but in the setting of acute MI, it's life-saving, proven in randomized trials. So, I think there are many ways that we can work together without confusing our two missions, which are different.
Earlier, you mentioned about evidence generation, and I'd like to spend a little time on that topic. So I'm not a clinician, and so I'm always, looking at this from a somewhat different perspective. And the use of real world evidence, first of all, it's a great choice of phrases, because who wouldn't want to use real world evidence? What do we want? Fake world evidence? But it has tremendous potential power, particularly given increasing computing technology and aftermarket surveillance. It also has potential for very distorted findings. I observe a push to greater reliance on it, and I'd be interested in your, again, maybe we'll start at the more general level of your take on it as a field and a topic and approach, and then go a little bit into some of the details.
Sure. I mean, the primer for me on this, I think, is really, really, really important. And let me start by saying I think that we desperately need a nomenclature. We need a compendium. I did this in 2016 together with between FDA and NIH on the issue of biomarkers, because we were observing that people were having thoughts about the power of biomarkers that were completely inappropriate for what could actually be done. And a lot of it was just a matter of confusion about the definitions of the difference between a biomarker and a surrogate, for example. And I think that helped. It's not been 100% successful, but it helped. And we need the same thing for clinical research. And I'd point out that there's real world data, which is obviously data from the real world, electronic health records, sensors, all that, as opposed to data collected in a research clinic. And I was intrigued that you used the term unreal world data. But in fact, a research clinic set off to the side is not exactly the same set of circumstances in which a medical product may be used later on. And it's an extrapolation to do an experiment in a controlled environment and then extrapolate to what's going to happen when you are out there in the real world. So, and then you have real world evidence, which in order to go from real world data to real world evidence, one must apply a method, a study design, an assessment of the quality of the data, and an analysis that's appropriate for that question. And by the way, randomization is one of the methods that's completely within the realm of real world evidence. In fact, the most important things I did in my career were clinical trials done on a global scale, collecting real world data and applying randomization to get an answer, because of the tremendous power of randomization when it comes to causal inference. And then I'd also point out that when it comes to using observational data to draw a causal inference, there has been a lot of progress. Most of the progress has shown that it's really hard to do. And most of what's been published so far is inappropriate by modern standard. You essentially need to be able to design and replicate the experiment that's being done as if it were a clinical trial. And I'd point particularly to time zero, which people tend to talk about confounding, which is a really big issue. But in a lot of things in medicine, treatments get used because something just happened. And if you don't know in your comparison group and your intervened upon group what they were like at time zero, the comparison can be just completely thrown off. And there's really good literature on this now. It's a very tough problem with a lot of these things. But I'd also point out real world evidence is great for a lot of other things. Just in the field of vaccination in COVID, the fact that we had phase 3 trials that were definitive, but then it's replicated in real world evidence at the level of clinical populations, but also when you look at what county you live in, what state you live in, what country you live in, the direct correlation between proportion vaccinated or up to date and the risk of death and hospitalization is profound. And so we got to look at this as a lot of different uses of real world evidence, but specifically when it's used for causal inference of whether a treatment has a particular effect, I think the methods have advanced, but doing it right is hard. You really have to think about it and do it right.
So I'm hearing a real role for it, but a role that fits within the limitations and the power of the methods and data that underlie it. That all makes sense to me. We have sustained challenges with underrepresented populations being participating in clinical trials. And that is another source of concern regarding the approval process. Is there a real world evidence role here to try to offset or overcome some of that?
Let me reiterate that I think the most powerful real world evidence when it comes to causal inference about a treatment intervention is collection of data in the real world using the power of randomization as a tool. And so if we take, for example, the population that's deteriorating the fastest in the US now with regard to life expectancy is the rural population. Obviously, the big academic medical centers are not in rural places, almost by definition. Even if they're in a rural state, they're in I was at Duke for many years. Raleigh-Durham is not exactly like a lot of the rest of North Carolina. So there's no reason why with modern technology, you shouldn't be able to conduct trials of people where they live in the clinics in which they work, taking advantage of the digital information that's available and employing randomization as a tool. And in fact, if you look at this evidence gap I talk about, I don't think we got a problem with phase 1, 2, and 3 in FDA parlance. That's done well. It's very expensive, probably could be less expensive if we optimize the digital pathways, but it basically works. The real problem is understanding what to do with the technology after it meets the basic. There actually is a treatment effect that's beneficial, at least in some population. I think the real key there is going to be much like the UK did in COVID with the recovery trials, doing research in practice, but not doing it sloppily, actually doing it using good, solid methods, which can be done much less expensively. I'd also point, long-term follow-up of things like gene therapy. We can't do that the old-fashioned way. We got to use real-world digital data. We're going to need to follow people, children who are now living who would have not survived. We're going to need to follow them for decades. Another good example. You can tell I could go on. I love this stuff. So I hope we make real progress during my term.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I won't let you go on here, but you've provided, I think, a very clear framework for the potential use, which is I think quite helpful to hear how you think about it, and particularly the critical role of randomization. I do want to have some time on the topics that you brought to the table at the beginning. It shouldn't just be my show. So I'm really interested in your focus on misinformation and disinformation. I can't help but think about that topic in the context of what, from the outside, certainly seemed to be political interference in the FDA processes in an earlier period, and how that real world experience evidence, if you'll forgive my hijacking of the term, makes it really hard to then convince people that information from certain sources is credible and not from others. So, but you teed it up as a priority for you. I think many of people in the health field are feeling the power and importance of the topic. Where would you go with it? And particularly, what's the FDA role?
Well, I'm hoping to spend about a year developing a strategy, which is what I think it's going to take. Stay tuned. There'll be some public meetings about it. And what I'd say is, well, first of all, on the political interference issue, the interaction, the commissioner's job, since I'm a political appointee, is largely to protect the civil service employees so they can do the things I talked about without bias or interference. But I think it's also a mistake to presume in something like a pandemic that politics and evidence can be just totally separate. But the real crux of the issue that I see is the advent of digital technologies, the internet, cell phones that are ubiquitous. certainly, was studying it before my first term. Then I spent 5 years at Alphabet, and got to see you're reaching. We were reaching over 1 billion people with multiple products at a time. But what's happened, in the good old days, as I call it, when I was a busy cardiologist, there was a hierarchy of information transmission. Companies developed products, they did their trials, the FDA adjudicated, the label was set, the continuing education and the promotion was done under the watchful eye of the FDA to learned intermediaries, the practitioners, and then the patients were at the end of that funnel. Now, of course, we now know that many, many people were completely left out of that system and didn't have access to the clinicians. But now everyone has access. Almost everyone has a cell phone. And the minute something is said by the FDA, for example, there's an avalanche of conflicting, differing opinions. And we have this new group of people I call the Twitterati, many of my friends, who, if they agreed with 95% of what the FDA said, would only talk about the other 5%, because that is understandable in academia. That's the interesting part of it. But if you're an average primary care physician or nurse practitioner or layperson, that's got to be confusing. And I think if we look at the vaccination problems we're having now and the difficulties with giving antivirals to people that need it, a lot of it, I think, is because there's just way too much information and not a way to navigate it. Now, a benefit of FDA commissioners, I can talk to anybody I want to. I've talked to many, many experts. We know a lot about misinformation. No one that I have found has a solution that they think will be successful at this point. And so, but what they all agree to is that, number one, the most effective way to counter misinformation is with a human interaction. And secondly, a federal agency is not the place to solve the problem because there's so much mistrust. And so we've got to build an ecosystem of people who are dedicated to reliable, useful information and willing to spend time on it. That's what I think. Now, you tell me how to do that.
That's why you need a year, right?
Yeah.
Well, I can't help say I was tripped up a moment when you said, of course, politics come in. It is a political appointment. And that is, of course, true. And yet, just from where I sit, and this is more a reflection. If you want to respond to it, please do. And if not, just take it for what it is, which is, I think to those outside, it's really important to differentiate between politics, which is about values, as in, is it more important? And maybe this is more a CDC issue than an FDA issue, but balancing the economic factors or the educational progress factors with the medical factors. That's a value judgment that is political because it's about values, as opposed to the sense of politics actually steering scientific results or casting scientific results in a certain way, which is not so much about values. It's really about not liking the results. You talked about confirmation bias a while ago. So I wonder if we could do a better job of explaining that following the science doesn't actually answer every question, because you have to make value judgments along the way, but science does have processes that, if you don't follow, really don't give you scientific answers either.
See, that's where, to me, the misinformation and evidence generation schemes come together, because they're different. Evidence generation, when I talk about, is usually talking about clinical trials or outcome studies, but it could pertain just as well to the basic underlying science. And you're absolutely right. If you don't follow the principles that are known, you're not likely to get a reliable answer, and we need those. But I would just add, and sort of in response to what you said, in a pandemic, things are very different, because in the world I grew up in cardiology, you did the trials, you got the results, and then you applied the results in the form of using the product. In a pandemic, if you wait to have the answer, the problem has already washed over you, and so you are making an educated guess to try to get one step ahead of the pandemic. And then it is opinion, and that's where the politics become difficult, because let's don't forget the funding of science is a political issue, right? Congress allocates the money. And if you don't have the funding, for example, to develop the next vaccine, it doesn't matter what your scientific principles are, you can't do it.
I also want to pick up the topic you mentioned of opioids and then broadening it out to other substances. I'd be really interested. I think the way you said it at the outset was that some people in their wisdom decided that these should be that this should sort of be up to the FDA. So obviously these are very different categories, and yet they have some commonalities. I wonder if you could say a little bit about why you put opioids, which are regulated drugs, in a similar category with cannabis, potentially in similar category with tobacco. What are the commonalities in how you think about those, but also what are the differences?
Well, I think I'll start with the differences. Obviously, as you point out, opioids started as a prescription drug. You could argue they started a long time before that. In fact, they did, as some combination of use by anesthesiologists and recreational people, and some famous physicians were known for both uses over time. But the origins of the opioid issue are different, and I think are unique for a whole variety of reasons, and a special burden and responsibility of the FDA because of the history of not doing the long-term studies, inappropriate promotion, all the things that have been in the news, which happened. And then we go to tobacco, which I spent years at Duke University, built on tobacco money. Probably the leading remediable cause of death in the world historically. And yet we still have 30 million people using tobacco products in the US, and over 500,000 people will die. And then you have cannabis, which in some ways I feel like I was a child of the 60s. High school graduation, 1969, we had marijuana and we had psychedelics, that were in the popular vernacular at the time, and we're back to even psychedelics now as therapeutics. So what do these things have in common? They're used sometimes for true medical purposes. Several of them can be used as a food or a component of food, and even animal food. Hemp in animal food is an example. And to some degree, more or less, they're thought to bring pleasure of some kind in a way where society has said, we're not going to prohibit this completely. We're going to have to regulate it. And so to me, it's fundamentally different to say we're regulating an industry, for example, that's developing life-saving drugs and devices where the criteria is it improves health, versus we're regulating something where the criteria is how do we minimize the harm done for something which is going to be used. And we got to figure that out. And I'll just say that several of the briefings I got in 2022 were absolutely no different than the ones I got in 2015. The can has been kicked down the road. And, my colleague, Janet Woodcock, who's, the source of much wisdom in the FDA, we're on a mission to not kick the can down the road on some of these things. It will cause some discomfort because, we talked about science and politics. These things are also characterized for the most part by the fact you don't have the same evidence you have in a phase 3 well-designed clinical trial very often. And so you've got to interpret data and put it in the context of public health. And also, I don't know how much time you spent in the economic field of lost consumer surplus, but there actually are people who say, I have an individual right to do things that I find pleasurable, even if they cause harm. So we've got to consider all those and come up with a scheme that's not kicking the can down the road. That's our goal. I hope that makes sense.
No, I think it's very helpful. As you introduced the topic, you referred to the 100,000 people who lost their lives in the last 12 months. So setting aside all of, I'm now going to not let you be the philosopher and take you back to the real world, setting aside the commonalities and differences across all of those, we really do have a crisis with respect specifically to opioid misuse. Is there something more specific from an FDA perspective that you can see directly addressing that one challenge?
Yes, and we're about 2 weeks away from putting out our framework. So stay tuned for the details. But what I will say, there's no magic bullet. There are about somewhere between a dozen and 30 things that need to be done. Each one is incremental. For example, we need to have much more naloxone out there. I'm a cardiologist. Occasionally someone drops over dead from ventricular fibrillation, and there's a defibrillator handy, and they go from being dead to being alive. Naloxone is the other example where someone is dead unless you give it at the right time, and if it's not there, you can't give it. So that's an example. But it's so complicated because you'd say, just make it over the counter. Well, guess what? Under the current regulations, if you make it over the counter, it may actually become more expensive because right now it's covered by health insurance. And so we got a lot of things to work out with each of these incremental steps. But together, I think we can have a significant impact. But that's for the old situation, which is still critically important, and we're still going to focus on. But I want to sound the alarm very loudly. The new problem we have is essentially mail order, high dose, chemically synthesized fentanyl coming in out of the country to teenagers who think they're getting a recreational OxyContin dose and are getting a lethal dose of fentanyl, and often mixed in with very high dose chemically synthesized methamphetamine. And that's more like a law enforcement issue. We have a key role there because we deal a lot with what's coming in from out of the country in the mail. But we have got to wake up to, while we're working on part one, we got to wake up to part two and pay a lot of attention to it.
I said at the outset we would focus on the medical side, and you mentioned in your opening that the F stands for food, and there's a lot of work to do over there. I won't ask you in the just couple of minutes we have left to give a tour of the food safety agenda, but I do want to ask about the relationship between the food and health side. And I don't know if we think of this as a safety issue, but there's certainly a huge portion of our health care challenge in this country is related to food, whether it's food insecurity on the access side or food consumption of unhealthy foods, or and is this really just two completely different arms of the FDA, or is there a somewhat overlapping circles here where we can think about the health effects of food, not purely from a safety purity perspective?
Absolutely. And, just back to terminology, I'd say there's a medical product side of the FDA and there's a food side, and we call it the food program because it includes nutrition, toxins like PFAS, which are not exactly the same as food outbreaks. And then, of course, a critical area of food safety as we think of it. We have 500,000 entities that are involved in food safety in the United States alone. And then we have like over 90% of our seafood is imported right now. So we also deal with that. But these things are all interrelated, and the science is converging. One of the biggest things in national academies going back 10 years was convergence of science. As everything's becoming digital, everything from supply chains to the chemistry, biology, genomics, we do whole genome sequencing of bacteria now to figure out whether a person who got sick actually is coming from the same exact bacterium that was found in a manufacturing plant. So there's tremendous overlap in concentration of the science. And we should not give short shrift at all to the nutritional side. We are responsible for almost all food labels. Department of Agriculture has some. And that is a huge part of what we do at the FDA. And of course, when we talk about the food side, we also have to mention cosmetics, dietary supplements, which have special things about them that I think also need attention right now.
Well, it's good to hear you referring to them as interrelated, and I think again from the outside it's easy to separate, but in the human body they aren't, and certainly from a regulatory approach they need to be thought of together. I always wind up these conversations by asking some more direct questions about your own career. If we have a lot of younger listeners who are thinking, gee, not only do I want to be FDA commissioner, I want to be FDA commissioner twice. So I'm sure that wasn't in your goal setting as a young professional, as a young clinician. But if you could share some steps along the way that have been really quite formative in landing you where you are, and particularly for our audience, I think the move from clinical practice and research into government and public policy, be great to hear some insights about that.
Sure. I mean, what happened to me was I was, gonna be a clinical psychologist. Then I worked in the South Carolina State prisons a couple of summers and decided I needed to do something more concrete. It was quite an experience. Was going to be a pediatrician, and then I happened to walk by an emergency department when someone died and was defibrillated, and I thought, wow, this is like amazing. I want to do this. I wanted to be a practicing cardiologist, and it just so happened that I got asked to run the coronary care unit while I was a fellow at Duke, the year that we figured out what caused heart attacks. And I had access at the time, this is 1982. They're all, that was the time when everyone wrote their prescriptions by hand and the notes. We had a computer. I know that sounds crazy that we'd even say that, but it was one of the only places in the world that had computing in medicine. And we became a data center. And I could literally treat people with serious disease, with a very high death rate right in front of me. We could develop new treatments, study them on a global basis, and get the answer. And that got me very involved with the FDA early on, because the studies we were doing led to the development of thrombolytic therapy and then coronary stents and defibrillators, as I've said. So I had a lot of experience with FDA. I was on advisory committees, and I had a great academic career. When Peggy Hamburg came to visit me one day and said, I'm getting ready to step down, maybe you should be the next commissioner. I said, hey, that sounds interesting. But she said, of course, the president has to ask you, and you can't be guaranteed that. But, I was a child of the 60s. I did not serve in Vietnam. I always felt that national service was important. So I said, what the heck? I've had a great career. I'm going to go to work as a civil servant. That was an amazing year I spent as a civil servant before President Obama called me in. And after I had tried to explain error rates in whole genome sequencing to him, which was the scene that led to him asking me to be commissioner. And then, of course, a surprise election happened, and I was out of a job. I had an amazing job at Alphabet, and a couple more years back at Duke doing policy things, including misinformation. I had no intention of coming back, not because I didn't love the place, but, I'm 70 years old and was having a great time living under the Golden Gate Bridge and part-time back in Durham. But by the time the call came, it just seemed there was a need for public service again. And I also felt like there were likely to be some very controversial issues that were going to require someone who was not necessarily looking for the next job and had a strong enough ego to be able to take the heat, because we have to make decisions whether we want to or not that affect a lot of people, and they have opinions about it. And I've sure validated that it takes a lot of ego strength. My ego has taken a beating the first 5 months. But, what I always tell young people is internal compass is the most important thing. You may lose some temporary skirmishes because you're honest and you have a strong internal compass, but if you keep that, ultimately in the long run, you will come out ahead. So that's the whole story, I guess, as best I know it. I feel lucky. I've had a great run. I'm going to take a lot more beatings coming up. I know that, but it's okay because the mission is wonderful.
Is there one tidbit from your Alphabet experience, given your sandwiching between that being the center of the sandwich between your two tenures? Is there one tidbit from Alphabet in your time there that has changed how you think about the FDA?
I think it's a source of frustration, really, more than anything. But my personality is such that I thrive on frustration because that's how I decide what I'm going to do next. I cannot stand to be in a situation where things are working because I always figured somebody else could do that. What I came to realize is that the digitization of information is profound. That's easy to say now, but the implications of it are really profound for a place like the FDA. And the analogy I just can't shake out of my head, and people told me to stop using it because I've used it too much, but you think about your life driving a car before maps were available. You remember the days when you pull off to the side of the road and try to figure out where you were. And now you just get in your car and start talking to it. It's using continuous artificial intelligence algorithms based on your preferences, based on real-time new information. And then compare that to what we're doing in the healthcare system and the medical products arena. There's so much that we can do. But I probably don't need to tell you that federal computing is not quite at the same level as Alphabet. It's not because there aren't great people, but the structure of the federal budget makes it really hard to make the investments that are needed to really do the upgrade on the system that would make a big difference. But that's probably, that car driving, I could give you 1,000. Let me just give you one other, Google Planet. Okay. Every acre of land in the world is mapped, including the inflow of water, the composition of the ground, all that kind of information you can get from digital information. Imagine, in a time of climate change, what you could do if you couple the power of biotechnology with plants and food of the future that could feed the world using these information sources. So I guess I'm old, but I'm still fired up about things that could be done.
Well, it's very evocative image, so thank you. Dr. Califf, thank you so much for taking the time with me, for serving our country in public service this second go around as well. To our audience, if you enjoyed the Policy Spotlight, go to our website, healthaffairs.org, to sign up for other future events. Join our email list so you can hear about them as they're announced. Last month, we launched Health Affairs Insider, a membership program offering exclusive access to content beyond the journal. If you become a Health Affairs Insider, you'll be able to participate in exclusive events, curated email newsletters, priority health topics, and more. You can sign up on our website. We do have a few more virtual events this month. You can see them up on the screen, Journal Club, and some professional development events as well. Thank you all for joining us. My final thanks again to Dr. Califf. We hope you found this useful and informative, and we are adjourned.